Let's talk about form validation in your React apps. There's a lot of moving parts that you might not think about, like validating server-side and handling form data objects, and validating on the client so you get live feedback while you're filling out a form. There are libraries that address some parts of the equation, but I want to give you the full stack solution. Let's jump into an example. We're going to build a ticketing site that takes your email, the amount of tickets you want, and writes to a database on success. And we're going to use my dream concert as an example, Sampha live in Brooklyn. If y'all haven't heard of this man, just go listen to his new album. It's absolutely flawless. But we have the event page. Now we want to add a form that takes all of those inputs and submits to a backend of some kind. We're going to do this demo using Astro, but stick around till the end. We're going to talk about Next.js as well in server actions. We're also going to use a flexible library I built for any framework called Simple Form. This lets you use Zod, which is a great validator for full stack apps, to make sure a form matches the format we expect, like numbers, strings, Boolean checkboxes, whatever you're working with, and gives you hooks both on the back end and the front end to validate everything. Let's take a look at the code. I have an Astro page right here, and we're using a dynamic parameter at the top. If you've used Next.js Pages Router, you probably know about this. We're going to take in the event name, and we're going to display our form and event description. This is pulling from a simple database. I wired this up using Cloudflare D1 because I'm fancy, but of course, you could use whatever SQL you want. And here's the schema for a little bit of visibility. We have an events table with the name, description, and ticket price, and an event can have multiple tickets. So the event ID and the email quantity and a newsletter opt-in for the right amount of spam when you sign up for an event. Because what's a ticketing site without a little spam, right? So let's add a form to this page. And we're going to start just with the backend piece. Use a lowercase form. We're going to send off a post request. And we're going to have all of our inputs as plain old HTML inputs. So the email, for example, is going to be a label of type email and an input right here, which is type email. If you didn't know, the browser supports an email type so that you get regexing and validation without having to write any client-side JavaScript. Pretty cool. We're also going to give it the name email and make sure it's required. And for the rest of the inputs, I just have a little snippet right here to save us some time. We have the quantity, and we have our checkbox to hear more about the next event in your area. We head back to our page here, and we can see that form appears for us. We have the email, quantity, hear about us. Nice. So now, in order to submit this, we're going to need a button, of course. So we'll add a button of type submit, which is actually the default, but we'll add it to be a little explicit. And we're going to add the backend code to receive this form. So we know it's going to be a post request. If you're using Astro, you can just check the request object directly. So you can say Astro request method and make sure that it is a post request. And then you can parse the information out of the form. I'm going to use this little ditty right here, grab the request post, and parse out the form data. This is a web standard object that can parse as JSON or form data in this case. And we'll use that object to grab our inputs and console log to make sure we receive everything. With all that wired up, we can head back to our page. We can type in an email that is totally not real. Please don't spam me. And we'll register for the event. You can see right here, we have our log, bogus, bholmesdev 3, and the value of the checkbox. If you didn't know, checkboxes are a little annoying to work with. They don't return true false booleans. They actually return the word on or the word off. It's weird. And that's the reason people reach for third-party libraries to parse these kinds of inputs. And we're going to do exactly that. We're going to install this into our project as simple stack form. You can also use the Astro add command if you want to be fancy. This will not only install the dependencies, but also give you the peer dependencies. And you can see right there, it's going to install Zod for us. It will also wire up our config to make sure all the types are up to date. And when we restart our dev server, we have access to all the simple form APIs. So to start, we're going to model our form now as a validator object. We're going to call this ticket form, and we'll use the create form utility to specify all the inputs. We're going to start with email. This is going to be zstring using Zod, and we'll make it an email input to use that email type we alluded to earlier. It'll handle that for you. You also have a quantity, which should be a number. It shouldn't be an int, but it would be nice to have a minimum value and a maximum in case we don't want too many tickets in someone's cart. Lastly, we'll add our newsletter boolean, and this will just be zeboolean. And you might imagine, what about all that parsing? You mentioned on-off being something we have to deal with. Well, using simple form, it will convert any on-off values to a Boolean for you, so you don't have to think about that. It'll also parse numbers and make sure of the min and max values, regex emails on the back end to make sure no malicious requests come through. All of that is handled. And if we want to parse the form request, we no longer need the conditional or any of that. We can instead say result is equal to Astro locals form. This is a middleware function that's available in all of your pages. And you can call get data. This is going to try and parse out any form data in the request. If there isn't any, result will just be empty. This is going to be like you visit the page for the first time, you haven't submitted anything yet. But as soon as you do submit a value, you'll get a data result with all of the parsed values. And if the parsing fails, you also get some field errors to display some nice styled error banners, however you want to do that. So now let's wire up those inputs. We don't really have to do any work if we don't want to deal with the input. I'm going to console log it right now to show what we're working with. And you can see it's undefined to start. But as soon as we request something from the page, we can increase that, register our form, and now we see our parsed results. So the email was valid, we get that. We get a quantity, now parsed to a number, and newsletter, now parsed to a Boolean. Don't have to deal with funky types anymore. Pretty nice. And it does give you some nice affordances to keep your inputs in line with your validator. You know, here we're manually saying this is type email and it has the name email. But if we change this to be user email, for example, or username or something like that, well, we want to make sure this name is updated as well. You can, of course, manage that manually, or you can use one of our utilities to spread all of the required props. And here we're going to say ticket form.inputprops.email. And this is going to apply all of the types. You can also see there, it detected that it's going to apply the type for us as well. So there really is nothing we got to do except add an ID for the label. And let's update those other inputs to match the prop spreading. If we head back to our UI, we notice it looks exactly the same. It applied the number and checkbox type for us. But what about those errors that we mentioned before? You know, we know what to do when it's successful, but what if there's too many tickets in the cart, for example? How do we show errors that came from the server? Well, you can check the result object for those. You can say res, and you'll notice it's data if it's successful, or field errors if something went wrong. For example, we might have an issue with the email, and this will log out any errors that might have come from the email input. It might say it's required, and it didn't match the regex, whatever set of error messages we might have. So we're going to map all of those out, and we'll also add a little CSS class to make it look nice. Now, if we head back to our UI, and we type in a bad email, for example, it will give us back an invalid email message. Pretty simple, right? So now let's actually persist this stuff in the database. We've been working with console logs, but we do have a server. So we'll say if there is data, do a db insert. This is going to prepare a SQL statement and grab out all of the data that's coming off of here. We just need a little question mark to make sure of that. I also added a little plus sign here. This is a way to quickly convert a Boolean to an integer value because a database only supports integers. Just a little shortcut to make everything work. We're also going to add a check if you did get a ticket. So this is going to be another database query. You can imagine we join on a user table to actually use authentication, but for now we'll just do it in a global way. Check if any tickets exist for that event and whether you checked out. And if there are tickets available, or if you did check out a ticket, we will render out a nice little success message. So we can see down here, you're going. You have purchased this many tickets for this event. Check your email for your tickets. Let's check the UI to make sure all of that stuff works as expected. I'll type in my bogus email again, increase the quantity, and submit that. Now we see, woo, you're going. You purchased 3 tickets. Check this email for your tickets. Okay, so we wrote an app that would make the 1990s internet proud. But we have client-side JavaScript, right? We could make this a little bit nicer. For example, say I type in a bad email and I move on to the next input. It shouldn't wait until I submit the form and send off to the server if something is wrong. It should give me some instant feedback like, whoa, 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 you typed in a username instead of an email. Back up, correct your error, and then move on. For that, we're going to use a little pattern that's called reward early, punish late. Let's take that backend validator and use it to make our front end feel snappy. We'll do this using the reward early, punish late pattern. This is a best practice of when to show error states to a user. Let's say we have a newsletter sign up form. The user comes in to fill out their email and maybe they type in their username by accident. We could wait for you to submit to validate that, but if we had a bunch of other inputs, it'd be really frustrating to validate that late in the game. So maybe we move validation to on input so it's live, but that gets pretty noisy. We're typing a single character draws your attention to an error state. That's too early. What if we used on blur instead? That way we only check your work when you move on to the next input so we know you're done. In other words, punish late. But what about when you go to correct the error? We could also use on blur for that, but that means the error lingers even when you've corrected it. You have to change focus to force it, which most people wouldn't think to do. In this case, I'd flip back to on input, so you get that feedback right when you correct it. In other words, reward early. So our pseudocode looks something like this. On blur, validate the form, and if it's invalid, track that it has errored before. Then on input, check if it has errored. Then we can enter our live validation mode. But you don't have to write that code. You can run simple form create to generate a form with all that code in your project. Let's see how that works. Thank you, Mr. Whiteboard. So let's apply what we learned there to our application. Luckily, simple form will code generate all of the code we need. I'm gonna call simple-form create, and that's going to detect whatever framework you're using. If you're in Next.js, for example, it'll give you a React template. We're using Preact because it's just React with less client-side JavaScript. It works the same way. So I'm going to say yes, plop it in my components folder, and we should see a form.tsx appear. This includes some niceties to validate individual fields and also track loading states and other things. It's provided by this big context object. But the part that you're probably wondering about is the actual form and input value. So the form is going to validate every time you try to submit, and it'll also give you a submit status if you want to show a loading indicator. And in the input section, we're applying the reward early, punish late pattern. So you can see on blur, we're going to validate that value. And on input, we're only going to validate if it is dirty or it has errored sometime in the past. You also notice this little special check right here to say, if it is like a required field and you left it empty, don't show that error message right away. Because it is really frustrating if you're tabbing through a form to see what you want to fill out, to leave this trail of required messages as you're working through it. So it's kind of a better practice to only show required banners when you hit submit. But for any other kind of error, like you typed out something and it's invalid, go ahead and do that on blur instead. So treat that as a little special case for required. Let's compose those into a client-validated form. I'm going to create a client-side component for this. I'll use the underscore convention so I can co-locate inside of the pages directory. If you're using Next.js and the app router, you would just call this ticket.tsx and put it alongside your page. And I'm going to add in a component. We'll call it function ticket, or probably ticket form so we know what we're talking about. And down here, we're going to add in our form from the components folder. This should auto-import for us, and it'll accept a validator, which is our Zod object that we created before. So I'm going to leave that blank for now, but we're going to grab that out of our server directory. And inside of here, we're going to add in all of our inputs. This is a nice little bit of autocomplete, but instead, I just want to grab all of the inputs out of here. And I also forgot to grab my button, so we'll do that as well. And you'll notice we get some red squigglies because we need our ticket form validator. So I'm going to grab this out of the server code as well. This is now going to ship client side. So whatever you put in your validation code, know that it is now running server and client. Zod is totally safe to ship to the client, and for simple forms like this, makes a lot of sense to use the same validation both places. Now for the validator, pass in the ticket form.validator. And for all of these inputs, we can actually remove the error messages, because if you replace lowercase input with uppercase input, this is going to render out those error messages for us. If we click into this, you can see down here, if there's any validation errors in the state, we will render it out here. And you can also style this yourself. I have an error class that I want to add, so I'll write that right there. We can replace all of the other code in here with the same sort of thing, lowercase to uppercase, upgrading our server logic to client logic, and that's pretty much everything we need. Now we'll head back to our server and we'll import all of those dependencies. So ticket form is now coming from the client file, and heading down here, we can replace our lowercase form with an uppercase form. So we're going to grab our ticket form component, and we're going to add a client directive. If you're using something like React Server Components, you'll put use client at the top of that ticket file. Or if you're using Astro, you put the client directive where you use the component. And load will make sure it is server rendered as well. And I'll add in the little conditional that I accidentally deleted. Head back up here, and we should see, going back to the client, the exact same form, now hydrated with React, or Preact in this case. So if we fill out a form and we put in a bad value, tabbing will immediately give you feedback. So we see the invalid email message right away. And as soon as we correct the error, it will have that message disappear. It'll also reappear if you're typing and you go from good to bad to good again, because once you've filled something out, you probably want live validation to really fix what's going on. For the quantity, we're also going to see something like that. If we put in 12, it needs to be less than or equal to 10. If you want to massage that to a better error message, you can totally override it. That's just a default that comes from Zod. And the same thing if we go too low. You can also put negative values on the browser if you're not careful. So go ahead and add a little bit of validation there. And once everything is filled out, it will successfully submit to the server. You're going, 10 tickets purchased, check your email. So pretty nice, right? Now we're validating things both client side and server side. And all we had to do was move our server code to a client module and import a couple components that we didn't even write ourselves. So as promised, I also have a Next.js example for you. You can find this on our example repositories with an online playground. And you can see we set up a sign-up form that's a little bit simpler to demo everything. So we are using the same create form utility. You can use this in any framework you want, coming from simple stack form/module. You can also use Zod just as we did in the Astro example. And to set up form actions and other things, we're going to use the client-side validator. So I have an example action right here that submits a sign-up form, and you can call this validate form utility that comes straight from simple stack form. This takes form data, your validator, and make sure that all of the data looks correct. We can see in the parse result, it's going to give you data or field errors, as you might expect. And if there is data, we're going to just console log it to make sure that everything is working correctly. Heading over to sign up, we can see we're using React's use form state in order to take whatever action we have and turn it into something that we can watch. This will give us that data when it comes down, and also the form action to wire into a form. You'll notice some squiggles though. That's because we want to generate a form for the first time. So we're going to call simple form create inside this Next.js example. Make sure you have simple stack form installed, and you'll get this nice command. You can also see we're using it outside of Astro, so it'll give us a generic React template, and it'll plop it in the components directory. You can see this generates a simple form the same way it did in Astro. The only difference is the submit handler. Instead of using Astro internals, it's now a generic bucket for you to put whatever logic you want, like fetching from a JSON API if you're using Next.js Pages Router or Remix. Or you can add in a server action call if you're using something more modern. We'll do that inside of here, remove that to do, and instead just call an action with the form data. And this action can come down as a prop, or you can just import it in line. I'm going to be a little bit more proper and add an action here. It's pretty simple type signature, takes form data, does some work on the server, and we'll use React's use form state in order to track the result. If we head back to our signup form, we can go ahead and pass this prop. You can see we're passing down that form action that we demoed earlier, and we're going to use the same uppercase form and uppercase input convention. Now we can start up our dev server to see that server action in action. Heading over here, it's a super simple page, Next.js full stack forms, and we can type in our name, the opt-in, and if we hit submit, we should see a console log on the other side. There we go, success, you have submitted the form. We're using use form state to track that. We can also see our parse data right here, username, and opt-in converted to a Boolean. All right, I hope there's some takeaways for form validation in your apps. Even if you don't use simple form, the reward early, punish late pattern is a really great way to do validation. If you're using final form or React hook form or tan stack form, which is a new one, they all offer utilities in order to make that pattern happen. And if you want to check out simple form, you can head over to simple-stack.dev. There's a whole suite of tools over there, including form management. All right, so if you like this video, drop a like, subscribe for regular content. I love working with React and Astro. So if you like that kind of content, I'll see you on the channel. All right, see you in the next video.